The rope cut deep into her wrists as the October wind howled through Copper Ridge. And though Beatrice Fletcher's screams were muffled by the crude gag they'd shoved between her teeth, the laughter of 6 drunken cowboys echoed through the canyon like the calls of hunting wolves. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but somewhere in the darkness, an Apache warrior named Koa was riding home from burying his wife, and he was about to stumble upon a scene that would change 2 broken lives forever. Beatrice Fletcher had never known hunger, never known want, never known the sting of cruel words spoken within earshot. At 19 years old, she was the pride of Copper Ridge, New Mexico Territory, the mayor's only daughter in a town where political power meant everything. And appearances meant even more. Her father, Mayor Theodore Fletcher, had built his fortune on silver mines and cattle ranches, transforming a dusty outpost into a thriving frontier settlement that attracted merchants, ranchers, and fortune seekers from across the territories.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The Fletcher mansion stood like a monument to prosperity on the hill overlooking Main Street, its white-painted wooden walls and wraparound porches, a stark contrast to the adobe buildings and ramshackle saloons that housed the working folk below. Beatrice's bedroom window offered a view of the entire valley, from the silver-veined mountains to the east where her father's mines carved wealth from stone, to the vast cattle ranges to the west where thousands of longhorns grazed under the endless southwestern sky. She had been beautiful once, in the delicate way that frontier society prized in its women. Petite, fair-skinned, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk and blue eyes that sparkled with innocence and privilege. The young men of Copper Ridge had competed for her attention at church socials and town gatherings, each hoping to catch the eye of the mayor's daughter and secure not just a bride, but a pathway to political and financial influence. But that was before her mother's death 3 years ago, before the grief-eating that had added 60 pounds to her small frame, before the cruel whispers started following her down Main Street like shadows that refused to fade. Now at nearly 200 pounds, Beatrice Fletcher had become something else entirely in the eyes of Copper Ridge society. No longer the Golden Princess, she had transformed into the town's embarrassment, a constant reminder that even wealth and position could not guarantee the perfect life that frontier mythology promised. The change had been gradual at first. After her mother Sarah's death from consumption, Beatrice had sought comfort in the kitchen, in the warm bread and sweet preserves that filled the hollow ache in her chest where love used to live. Her father, consumed by his own grief and the demands of running a growing town, had barely noticed as his daughter's dresses grew tighter, as her face grew rounder, as the young men stopped calling at their front door. By her 18th birthday, the transformation was complete. The belle of Copper Ridge had become its cautionary tale, whispered about in sewing circles and discussed in hushed tones at church gatherings. Poor Beatrice Fletcher, they would say, shaking their heads with false sympathy. Such a pretty girl before she let herself go. The young men who had once competed for her favor now crossed the street to avoid her, their eyes filled not with desire but with disgust and barely concealed mockery. The plan had been born in the smoke-filled back room of Hannigan's saloon on a Saturday night when 6 cowboys from the Double Bar Ranch had consumed too much whiskey and too little sense. Jake Morrison, the foreman's son with his perfectly waxed mustache and cruel green eyes, had been regaling his companions with increasingly elaborate tales of conquest and cruelty, when someone mentioned seeing Beatrice Fletcher at the general store that afternoon. Did you see the way she could barely fit through the door?" laughed Tommy Briggs, a thin-faced ranch hand with yellow teeth and a reputation for violence. "Like watching a cow try to squeeze into a chicken coop. I swear the whole building shook when she walked." The other men roared with laughter, slapping the table and calling for another round of rot-gut whiskey. "Shame what happened to that girl," added Buck Henley, though his tone carried no sympathy, only the satisfied cruelty of a man who had never known real hardship. "Used to be the prettiest little thing in the territory. Now look at her, fat as a prize hog and twice as ugly. Her daddy must be ashamed to show his face in polite company." More laughter, more whiskey, more venom disguised as humor. "Jake." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering with the kind of malicious intelligence that turned pranks into torture and humor into horror. "You know what this town needs?" he said slowly, letting the words hang in the smoky air like a noose waiting to drop. "A reminder of what happens when people forget their place. When they get too comfortable, too soft, too fat and lazy to remember that some folks just don't belong." The other men leaned forward, sensing something darker than their usual cruel entertainment. "What are you thinking, Jake?" asked Charlie Watts, a scarred cowboy whose missing left ear testified to his willingness to engage in violence for sport. The room grew quiet, except for the distant sound of piano music from the main saloon and the occasional burst of laughter from more innocent revelry. Jake's smile was the kind that rattled snakes' roar before they struck. "I'm thinking it's time Beatrice Fletcher learned what it feels like to be the entertainment instead of the audience. Time she found out what happens when the pretty little princess becomes the town joke. And I'm thinking we're just the boys to teach her that lesson." The conspiracy was born in that moment, nurtured by alcohol and cruelty, fed by the particular kind of masculine violence that frontier life bred in men who had too much power and too little conscience. The note that arrived at the Fletcher mansion on Tuesday morning was written in careful script on expensive paper, the kind that suggested refinement and education. It was addressed to Miss Beatrice Fletcher in elegant handwriting that spoke of boarding school education and cultured upbringing. The message was simple, almost innocent in its deception. "Dear Miss Fletcher, I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. I am writing to request a private meeting to discuss a matter of great importance regarding your late mother's charitable work with the Apache Reservation. There are certain funds and commitments that require your immediate attention, but the sensitive nature of this business necessitates discretion. Please meet me at the old chapel ruins east of town at midnight on Thursday. Come alone, as this matter involves certain political sensitivities that your father's position makes delicate. I remain your humble servant, Jonathan Whitmore, attorney at law." The signature was flourished and confident, the paper scented with lavender. Beatrice read the letter 3 times, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had heard whispers of her mother's charitable work with the local Apache tribes, secret donations of food and medical supplies. That had been controversial even among Copper Ridge's more progressive residents. The idea that her mother had left unfinished business, charitable commitments that now fell to her daughter, filled Beatrice with a sense of purpose she had not felt since before her mother's death. The secrecy of the meeting did not alarm her. She understood the political realities of frontier life, knew that her father's position as mayor required careful navigation of the complex relationships between white settlers and native tribes. Public knowledge of charitable work with the Apache could damage his political standing among the more militant elements of Copper Ridge society. Men who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and who viewed any cooperation as weakness or betrayal. Thursday night arrived with unseasonable warmth for October, the kind of still heavy air that pressed down on the high desert like a wool blanket. Beatrice dressed carefully in her darkest dress, a navy blue wool that she hoped would help her blend into the shadows, though at her size, concealment was largely impossible. She waited until her father had retired to his study with his evening whiskey and newspaper, before slipping out through the kitchen door into the moonlit night. The walk to the chapel ruins took nearly an hour, her heavy breathing and awkward gait making the journey more difficult than it would have been for someone half her size. The old chapel had been built by Spanish missionaries decades earlier, abandoned when the Apache Wars made the isolated location too dangerous to maintain.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Now it stood as a crumbling monument to failed dreams, its adobe walls broken and scattered, its wooden roof long since collapsed under the weight of winter snows and summer storms. They were waiting for her in the shadows like wolves around a campfire, their faces hidden by bandanas and their eyes glittering with anticipation. The moment Beatrice entered the ruined chapel, calling softly for the mysterious attorney who had summoned her, Jake Morrison stepped into the moonlight with a rope in his hands and cruelty in his smile. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. "Look what we caught ourselves, boys. A real live whale, beached right here in our little chapel. Must be our lucky night." The other 5 emerged from their hiding places like creatures from a nightmare, surrounding her before she could turn and run. Beatrice's scream died in her throat as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her like an avalanche. There was no attorney, no charitable business, no noble purpose to her midnight journey. She had been lured into a trap by men who saw her not as a human being but as entertainment, as prey, as something to be tormented for their amusement. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Please, I haven't done anything to you. I'll give you money, anything you want. Just please let me go home." Her words came out in a rush, desperate and pleading, but they only seemed to encourage her tormentors. "Money?" laughed Tommy Briggs, circling her like a buzzard around carrion. "Honey, we don't want your daddy's money. We want something much more valuable than that. We want to give this town a show they'll never forget. We want to remind everyone what happens when people get too big for their britches, literally in your case." The other men cackled at his crude humor. Buck Henley produced a length of rough hemp rope from his saddlebag, the kind used for securing cattle during roundups. "See, Miss Fletcher, you've become what folks call a problem. Walking around town like you own the place, taking up space that decent folks need, making everyone uncomfortable with your presence. Time someone taught you some humility." His words were delivered with the casual cruelty of a man discussing the weather. The struggle was brief and futile. 6 strong men against one frightened woman who had never known violence, never learned to fight, never imagined that her own neighbors could harbor such darkness in their hearts. They bound her wrists with practiced efficiency, the rope cutting into her soft flesh as they pulled the knots tight. A dirty bandana was shoved into her mouth, muffling her screams and turning her pleas into unintelligible moans of terror. The old cottonwood stood alone in a clearing half a mile from the chapel ruins, its massive trunk scarred by lightning, and its bare branches reaching toward the star-filled sky like the arms of a supplicant, begging for mercy from an indifferent God. It was here that they dragged her, stumbling and falling in the darkness, her dress torn by thorns and her face streaked with tears that reflected the moonlight like silver coins. Jake Morrison selected the tree with the care of an artist choosing his canvas. "Perfect," he declared, running his hands over the rough bark. "Visible from the main road, but far enough out that no one will stumble across our little exhibition until we're good and ready. This old tree is about to become famous, boys. People will be talking about tonight for years to come." The enthusiasm in his voice was more terrifying than anger would have been. They bound her to the massive trunk with additional ropes, wrapping the hemp around her waist and chest, securing her arms behind the tree so that she could not move, could not escape, could barely breathe. The rough bark scraped against her back through the thin fabric of her dress, and the ropes cut into her flesh wherever they touched. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation, the knowledge that she had been reduced to an object, a thing to be displayed for the entertainment of others. "Now for the finishing touches," announced Charlie Watts, producing a piece of paper and a charcoal pencil from his vest pocket. With exaggerated care, he wrote a message in large, crude letters: "Fatty Fletcher, Town Eyesore, free viewing." He tied the sign around her neck like a necklace, the paper rustling in the night breeze. Tommy Briggs stepped back to admire their handiwork, his head tilted like a critic examining a painting in a gallery. "Beautiful," he declared. "Just beautiful. Come morning, every person heading into town is going to get an eyeful of what we think about folks who don't know their place. Might encourage some others to think twice before they get too comfortable." The cruelty in his voice was matched only by the satisfaction. They left her there as the moon began its descent toward the western horizon, their laughter echoing across the high desert as they rode back toward town in comfortable beds and dreams, untroubled by conscience. Beatrice Fletcher, mayor's daughter and former belle of Copper Ridge, hung against the cottonwood tree like a broken doll, alone with her shame and terror, and the growing certainty that morning would bring not rescue, but an audience for her degradation. The hours passed like years, each minute stretching into eternity as Beatrice fought against the ropes that held her prisoner and the panic that threatened to drive her mad. The night sounds of the high desert seemed amplified in her terror. Every owl's call, every coyote's howl, every rustle of wind through the dry grass became a potential threat, a new source of fear in a situation already beyond her worst nightmares. The rope around her chest made breathing difficult, and her position against the tree sent waves of pain through her back and shoulders. Her wrists had gone numb hours ago, the circulation cut off by the tight bonds that held her arms immobilized. But worse than the physical discomfort was the mental anguish, the knowledge that dawn would bring discovery, that her humiliation would become public entertainment for the entire territory. She thought of her father, probably asleep in his study with a newspaper across his chest and an empty whiskey glass on the table beside him. He would wake in the morning, expecting to find her in her room, perhaps reading one of the novels that had become her escape from the cruel realities of her social isolation. Instead, he would discover that his daughter had become the territory's most infamous spectacle. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, beautiful and cold and eternal. Beatrice had always loved astronomy, had spent countless hours on the mansion's roof with her mother's telescope, mapping constellations and dreaming of distant worlds where kindness mattered more than appearance. Now those same stars seemed to mock her predicament, their light illuminating her shame for any late-night traveler who might happen upon the scene. As the night reached its deepest point, just before the first pale hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Beatrice. Fletcher closed her eyes and prepared to face whatever morning would bring. She had no way of knowing that less than a mile away, an Apache warrior named Koa was guiding his horse through the darkness, returning from a sacred burial ground where he had finally laid his beloved wife to rest, and that her nightmare was about to become his moment of choice between the bitter path of revenge and the harder road of redemption. Koa had been riding for 3 days through the sacred mountains of his ancestors, carrying the weight of grief that had pressed against his chest like a stone for the past 2 moons. The burial ceremony for his wife Ayana had taken place at dawn on the peak where her grandmother's bones had been laid to rest generations before, where the wind carried prayers to the spirit world and the morning sun blessed the departed with golden light that seemed to come from the realm of the dead themselves. He was 34 years old, a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache who had learned to move between 2 worlds with the fluid grace of a man who belonged fully to neither. Raised on the reservation but educated in the white man's schools, fluent in English and Spanish as well as his native tongue, Koa had spent his adult life serving as a translator and negotiator between his people and the territorial government, a bridge between cultures that seemed destined to destroy each other. His horse, a paint stallion named Stormwalker, picked its way carefully down the rocky trail that led from the high peaks toward the valley, where the white settlements clustered around silver mines and cattle ranches. The animal sensed its rider's mood, moving with unusual quiet through the pre-dawn darkness, its hooves finding purchase on stone worn smooth by countless generations of Apache travelers. Ayana had died of the white man's tuberculosis, the wasting disease that had claimed so many of his people since the reservation had been established. She had fought the sickness for nearly a year, growing thinner and weaker despite the ministrations of both Apache medicine men and the agency doctor, until finally her spirit had simply let go, releasing itself from a body that could no longer contain her fierce love of life. The marriage had been controversial among both their peoples. Ayana was the daughter of a respected war chief who had never made peace with the white man's ways, while Koa's work as a translator made him suspect among the more traditional Apache who viewed any cooperation with the territorial authorities as collaboration with the enemy. Their love had transcended politics and cultural boundaries, but it had also isolated them from both communities they called home. Now, with Ayana's bones resting in the sacred ground of their ancestors and her spirit released to join the eternal dance of the stars, Koa found himself truly alone for the first time in his adult life. The reservation held too many memories of shared laughter and whispered conversations, while the white settlements represented the world that had ultimately killed his wife with its diseases and its disruption of the ancient ways that had kept his people healthy for countless generations. The trail descended through stands of pine and aspen, their leaves rustling in the night wind like the voices of spirits offering comfort to the grieving. Koa had not eaten in 2 days, following the traditional Apache custom of fasting during the mourning period, and the hunger had sharpened his senses until every sound, every scent, every movement in the darkness registered with crystalline clarity. He thought of the white officials who would be expecting his return to the reservation, the endless meetings and negotiations that comprised his official duties as a cultural liaison. There would be disputes over water rights and grazing permits, complaints about young Apache men leaving the reservation without passes, tensions over the government's latest attempts to force his people to abandon their traditional ways in favor of farming and Christianity. The work had once given his life meaning, had made him feel like he was serving his people by protecting them from the worst excesses of territorial politics and racial hatred. But Ayana's death had drained the purpose from these efforts, leaving him questioning whether his years of compromise and diplomacy had accomplished anything beyond legitimizing the slow destruction of Apache culture. Stormwalker's ears pricked forward suddenly, and Koa felt the horse's muscles tense beneath him. The stallion had detected something in the darkness ahead, some sound or scent that triggered its prey animal instincts. Koa's hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle, though he doubted that any threat lurked in these remote canyons where even the most adventurous white settlers rarely ventured. The sound that reached his ears was so faint that he might have dismissed it as wind through the rocks, if not for Stormwalker's continued alertness. It was a human sound, a soft moaning that carried the unmistakable note of distress, of suffering that had moved beyond the realm of mere physical discomfort into something deeper and more desperate. Koa dismounted and led his horse forward. On foot, moving with the silent grace that had made him legendary among both Apache warriors and territorial scouts. The sound grew stronger as he approached a clearing where an ancient cottonwood stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its massive trunk and spreading branches creating a pool of deeper shadow in the moonlit landscape. What he found, tied to that tree, challenged every assumption he had ever made about the nature of human cruelty and the depths to which supposedly civilized people could sink in their treatment of the vulnerable and defenseless. The woman bound to the cottonwood was clearly white, her pale skin and golden hair marking her as a member of the race that had brought disease and displacement to his people. But her condition transcended racial boundaries and spoke to something universal about suffering and degradation. She was larger than any woman Koa had ever seen, her body straining against ropes that cut deep into soft flesh and a dress that had been torn by thorns and stained with tears and dirt. The crude sign hung around her neck like a badge of shame, its message visible even in the dim starlight, proclaiming her worthlessness for all the world to see. But it was her eyes that stopped Koa's heart and challenged every bitter thought he had harbored about the white race since Ayana's death. They were blue eyes, the color of deep water or summer sky, and they held a pain so profound and complete that it transcended the physical bonds that held her captive. Here was suffering that matched his own, anguish that spoke to the universal human experience of abandonment and betrayal. The woman had noticed his approach, and her initial reaction was pure terror, the kind of primal fear that comes from hours of helplessness and the certain knowledge that any human contact could bring fresh torment. She tried to shrink back against the tree, tried to make herself smaller and less visible, but the ropes that bound her allowed no escape from whatever new horror she imagined was approaching. Koa stood perfectly still for a long moment, allowing her to see him clearly in the moonlight, letting her register that he carried no weapons in his hands and made no threatening gestures. He had learned through years of negotiation that panic could be managed with patience, that fear could be slowly transformed into trust through careful demonstration of peaceful intent. "I will not hurt you," he said softly in accented English, his voice carrying the formal cadence of a man who had learned the language in schools rather than saloons. "I am going to cut your bonds and take you to safety, but I need you to remain calm and quiet while I work." The woman's eyes widened at the sound of his voice, and he realized that his Apache features and traditional dress had added another layer of terror to her already overwhelming fear. The knife that Koa drew from his belt was a work of art, its steel blade hand-forged by his grandfather, and its handle carved from elk antler and wrapped with sacred buckskin. He had used this blade to skin deer and cut lodge poles, to defend his life in combat and to carve toys for children. But never had it been employed in an act of liberation quite like this. Working with infinite care, he began cutting through the ropes that held the woman prisoner, starting with the bonds around her wrists where the hemp had cut deepest into her flesh. The circulation had been cut off for hours, and he knew that the restoration of blood flow would bring intense pain. But it was necessary if permanent damage to nerves and tendons was to be avoided. "What is your name?" he asked quietly as he worked, partly to distract her from the pain of returning circulation, and partly because he needed to know who she was if he was going to help her navigate the complex social and political realities that would follow her rescue. The question seemed to surprise her, as if she had forgotten that she possessed an identity beyond the cruel designation on the sign around her neck. "Beatrice," she whispered through lips cracked and swollen from hours of forced silence. "Beatrice Fletcher. My father is the mayor of Copper Ridge." The information explained much about her situation, confirming Koa's suspicion that this was not a random act of violence, but a calculated attack on someone whose social position made her a target for the kind of men who found entertainment in the suffering of others. As the last rope fell away and Beatrice collapsed forward into Koa's arms, he caught her with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were calloused from decades of hard living, and whose body bore the scars of countless battles. She was heavier than he had expected, but he held her steady as feeling returned to her limbs, and the reality of her rescue began to penetrate the fog of terror and despair that had clouded her mind. "Who did this to you?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. There were only so many men in the territory with the combination of cruelty and cowardice necessary to attack a defenseless woman, and fewer still who would dare to target the daughter of Copper Ridge's most powerful political figure. The story came out in broken whispers as Koa helped her sit against a boulder where she could rest while he examined her injuries and planned their next move. Jake Morrison and his companions, the false letter, the trap at the chapel ruins, the long night of terror and humiliation, each detail added another layer to Koa's understanding of the depth of evil that had motivated this crime. Koa found himself at a crossroads that would define not only the immediate future, but the entire trajectory of his life in the years to come. The traditional Apache way would be to seek immediate vengeance, to track down the men responsible for this atrocity and extract payment in blood for their crimes against an innocent woman. His warrior training and cultural upbringing demanded nothing less than the complete destruction of those who had committed such an act. But his years of education in white schools and his work as a cultural bridge had taught him that vengeance, however satisfying in the moment, rarely solved the deeper problems that gave rise to such cruelty. The men who had done this were symptoms of a larger disease, representatives of an attitude toward women in power that infected much of frontier society. More immediately, he faced the practical problem of what to do with Beatrice Fletcher in her current condition. She was in no shape to ride, barely able to stand without assistance, and the journey back to Copper Ridge would take hours through difficult terrain. But leaving her here while he went for help was equally impossible, given that her attackers might return to check on their handiwork. There was also the question of how his involvement would be perceived by both the white and Apache communities. Koa's position as a cultural liaison depended on his reputation for neutrality and diplomatic discretion, qualities that would be severely tested if he became entangled in a scandal involving the mayor's daughter and a group of prominent local cowboys. But as he looked at Beatrice Fletcher huddled against the boulder with her torn dress and traumatized eyes, Koa realized that some choices transcended political calculation and cultural considerations. This was a moment that called for simple human compassion, for the kind of moral courage that his wife Ayana had always insisted was the true measure of a person's worth. "Can you ride?" he asked gently, knowing that the answer would determine their options for the immediate future. Beatrice shook her head weakly, her body still trembling from shock and exhaustion. The long night of terror had drained her physical reserves, and the restoration of circulation to her bound limbs had left her barely able to maintain consciousness. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable rather than chosen, as if the entire course of Koa's life had been leading to this moment of moral clarity. He could not take her back to Copper Ridge in her current condition, could not deliver her to a town that had produced the men who had tortured her for sport. But neither could he abandon her to face the consequences of her rescue alone. "There is a place," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a commitment that would change everything about his carefully constructed life. "A cabin in the mountains where you can recover safely while we decide what must be done about the men who harmed you. It is isolated, hidden, but it has everything needed for healing." The offer was made without expectation of gratitude or reward, simply because it was the right thing to do. The cabin he referred to was his own private retreat, a small structure he had built in a hidden valley, where he went to escape the pressures of his official duties and the constant tension of living between two worlds. It was supplied with food and medical supplies, furnished with simple comfort, and most importantly, completely unknown to anyone else in the territory. Beatrice looked up at him with eyes that still held traces of disbelief, as if kindness from a stranger was so foreign to her experience that she could not quite accept its reality. "Why?" she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of rejection and cruelty. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me, and I'm nothing special. Just the fat daughter of a man who probably won't even notice I'm missing." Koa's response came from a place deeper than conscious thought, from the wellspring of wisdom that Ayana had always insisted lived in the hearts of all truly good people. "Every person has value," he said simply. "Every life has meaning. What was done to you was wrong, and anyone who stands by and allows wrong to continue becomes part of the wrong themselves." The words were spoken with the quiet conviction of a man who had spent his life trying to live according to principles rather than convenience. Loading Beatrice onto Stormwalker required patience and careful planning, as her size and weakened condition made mounting the horse a significant challenge. Koa fashioned a makeshift support system using his saddle blanket and rope, creating a secure seat that would allow her to ride safely while he walked alongside, leading the horse through the treacherous mountain terrain. The journey to the hidden cabin took nearly 4 hours, winding through narrow canyons and across rocky ridges where a single misstep could mean disaster for both horse and riders. Koa moved with the sure-footed confidence of a man who had traveled these trails since childhood, reading the landscape like a familiar book and avoiding the paths where loose rock or hidden crevices might pose a threat. Beatrice drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion that adrenaline had held at bay during her long ordeal. Each time she woke, she found herself surprised anew by the gentle rocking motion of the horse and the quiet presence of the Apache warrior who had become her unexpected savior. The stars began to fade as they climbed higher into the mountains, and the first pale hint of dawn was touching the eastern peaks when Koa finally led Storm Walk her into the hidden valley where his cabin stood among the pines like a sanctuary carved from the wilderness itself. The structure was small but well built, constructed from local timber and stone with the kind of careful craftsmanship that spoke of a builder who intended his work to last. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a simple bed, shelves lined with books in multiple languages, and supplies sufficient to support a solitary resident for months at a time. It was here that Koa had retreated during the worst periods of Ayana's illness, here that he had grieved in private and struggled to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything he loved. As he helped Beatrice from the horse and guided her into the cabin's welcoming warmth, Koa realized that this place of solitary healing was about to become something entirely different. No longer a retreat from the world's pain. It would become a sanctuary where two wounded souls might find the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead in a territory where justice was rare and mercy even rarer. Dawn broke over the hidden valley like a whispered prayer, painting the cabin walls with streaks of gold and crimson that filtered through windows Koa had cut himself from salvaged glass. Beatrice Fletcher woke to sensations she had forgotten existed. Warmth without fear, softness without judgment, and most remarkably, silence that held no threat of discovery or mockery. The bed beneath her was narrow but clean, covered with wool blankets that smelled of pine smoke and mountain air, rather than the harsh lye soap and fierce sweat that had clung to her during the endless night at the cottonwood. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through muscles cramped from hours of immobility and rope burns that had carved angry red lines into her flesh. But beneath the physical discomfort lay something else, something she struggled to identify until she realized it was the absence of immediate terror. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not bracing herself for the next cruel word or mocking laugh. The cabin's interior revealed itself gradually as her eyes adjusted to the morning light. It was a single room dominated by the stone fireplace where embers from the previous night's fire still glowed like sleeping stars. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books whose titles she could not read in the dim light, while another wall held tools and supplies arranged with military precision. The overall effect was one of careful solitude, a space designed for a man who valued function over decoration, but was not entirely without aesthetic sensibilities. Koa sat in a wooden chair near the fireplace, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the window that she could not see from her position on the bed. He had changed from his traveling clothes into a simple white cotton shirt and dark trousers, but he still wore the silver bracelet that had caught moonlight during her rescue, its polished surface now reflecting the warm glow of morning sun. He appeared to be waiting, though for what, she could not imagine. The silence stretched between them like an unspoken question, filled with the weight of circumstances that neither had chosen, but both would have to navigate. Beatrice found herself studying her rescuer's profile, noting the strong jaw and high cheekbones that marked his Apache heritage, the silver threading through black hair that suggested he had seen more than his share of hardship, and the patient stillness that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude. "You are awake," he said without turning from the window, his voice carrying the same formal courtesy that had marked their first conversation. "There is water for washing and clean clothes if you feel strong enough to stand. The basin is behind the screen in the corner." He gestured toward a section of the cabin where canvas stretched between wooden poles created a private space for personal needs. Moving proved more difficult than Beatrice had anticipated. her body protesting each attempt to shift position as circulation slowly returned to limbs that had been compressed for hours. The rope burns on her wrists and waist blazed with fresh pain when she attempted to sit up, and her legs trembled with weakness that seemed to come from some deep place beyond mere physical exhaustion. Koa rose from his chair with fluid grace and approached the bed with the careful movements of someone accustomed to dealing with wounded creatures, both human and animal. "You need not push yourself beyond what your body can manage," he said quietly, his tone carrying neither impatience nor false sympathy. "Healing takes time, and there is no schedule we must keep in this place." His words carried the ring of personal experience, as if he had learned patience through his own encounters with recovery. He helped her sit on the edge of the bed, his hands steady and impersonal as he supported her weight, without making her feel helpless or clumsy. The simple act of vertical positioning brought a rush of dizziness that made the cabin spin around her, but Koa's presence provided an anchor point until the sensation passed and the world settled back into proper orientation. "The men who did this to you," he said carefully, his dark eyes studying her face for signs of renewed distress. "They will expect to find you still bound to that tree this morning. When they discover you are gone, they will search, but they will not think to look in Apache territory. This valley has been forgotten by most white men, and those who remember it believe it cursed. We have time to plan, but we must use that time wisely." The practical nature of his words helped ground her in reality. Beatrice nodded slowly, her mind beginning to function beyond the immediate concerns of pain and fear. "My father," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of muffled screaming. "He will have discovered I am missing by now. He will be organizing search parties, offering rewards." The thought of Mayor Theodore Fletcher's political machinery grinding into action brought both comfort and anxiety. Koa's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications of her words. "Your father's searchers will look in the wrong places and ask the wrong questions, because they will assume you were taken by strangers, perhaps Mexican bandits or rogue Apache. They will not suspect that the town's own young men could be capable of such cruelty. This gives us an advantage, but it also means that justice will not come from conventional sources." His analysis was delivered with the detached precision of a military strategist. As the morning progressed and Beatrice's strength slowly returned, the silence between them evolved into tentative conversation, punctuated by long pauses and careful consideration of words. Koa prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge and wild berry preserves, moving around the small kitchen area with economical efficiency that spoke of long practice in solitary living. "You speak English very well," Beatrice observed, surprised by the clarity of his diction and the complexity of his vocabulary. The comment was innocent, born of curiosity rather than prejudice, but she immediately regretted it as she realized how it might sound to someone whose people had been consistently underestimated and dismissed by white society. Koa paused in his food preparation, his hands still for a moment before resuming their work. "I was educated at the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania," he said without turning around. "Kill the Indian, save the man," they called it. 3 years of learning to be ashamed of everything that made me who I was. 3 years of being told that my people's ways were savage and primitive. His tone remained neutral, but Beatrice could hear the buried pain beneath the careful words. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it more deeply than such words usually carried. "I didn't mean to imply that you shouldn't speak well. I just thought that. I suppose I've never had a real conversation with an Apache person before." The reservation is so far from town, and my father always said." She trailed off, realizing that whatever her father had said about Apache people was probably not something she should repeat to an Apache man who had saved her life. "Your father said that we are dangerous, unpredictable, best kept at a distance, where we cannot corrupt decent white people with our savage ways," Koa finished for her, his tone carrying dry humor rather than anger. "I know what men like your father say about my people. I have spent years listening to such words in council meetings and treaty negotiations. The remarkable thing is not that you believe them, but that you are capable of questioning them now." His response carried neither accusation nor forgiveness, simply acknowledgement of reality. The breakfast that followed was consumed in companionable quiet, both of them apparently lost in their own thoughts about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Beatrice found herself studying Koa's face when she thought he was not looking, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had prepared her food with every story she had ever heard about Apache warriors and their legendary ferocity in battle. As the morning sun climbed higher and painted the valley in shades of green and gold, Koa began to share pieces of his own story with the careful deliberation of someone testing the waters of trust. He spoke of his wife Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in his language, and whose death from white man's tuberculosis had left him questioning everything he had believed about the possibility of peaceful coexistence between their peoples. "She was beautiful," he said, staring into the fire he had built to ward off the mountain chill. "Not in the way white men define beauty, but in the way my people understand it. She moved like water over stones, spoke like wind through pine trees, laughed like the first rain after a long drought. When she smiled, the world became a place worth living in." His words carried the weight of fresh grief, love transformed into memory but not yet diminished by time. Beatrice found herself leaning forward, drawn into his narrative despite her own pain and confusion. There was something in his voice when he spoke of his wife that she had never heard from any man, a quality of reverence and genuine affection that stood in stark contrast to the crude jokes and calculating assessments that seemed to characterize most male discussions of women in her experience. "The disease took her slowly," Koa continued, his hands working a piece of leather as he spoke, the repetitive motion apparently helping him manage the emotion that threatened to overwhelm his careful composure. "Month by month, breath by breath, until finally she just let go. The agency doctor said there was nothing more that could be done, that her lungs were too damaged to sustain life. But I think she simply decided that a world where her people were dying of diseases they had never known was not a world she wanted to inhabit any longer." The leather twisted in his hands like a living thing, the parallel between his loss and her own isolation was not lost on Beatrice, though the circumstances were vastly different. Both of them had been forced to watch something precious slip away while feeling powerless to prevent the loss. His wife had died of disease, while her own sense of self-worth had been slowly murdered by cruelty and rejection. But the end result was the same. Two people learning to navigate a world that had taken away their reason for existing. "Is that why you were out there last night?" she asked softly. "Because of your wife?" The question felt presumptuous, but something in his manner suggested that he might welcome the opportunity to speak of things he had been carrying alone for too long. Koa's hands stilled on the leather he had been working, and for a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a hawk circling the valley. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of ritual and tradition, of ceremonies older than the white settlements that now dotted the territory like scars on ancient skin. I had taken her bones to the sacred burial ground where her grandmother rests, he said, his eyes focused on something beyond the physical walls of the cabin. Among my people, the dead must be properly honored if their spirits are to find peace in the next world. For 2 moons I had delayed this duty, unable to accept that she was truly gone, unable to face the finality that the ceremony would represent. His admission of weakness was offered without shame, as a simple statement of human limitation. The burial ceremony had taken place at dawn on a peak that had been sacred to his people for countless generations, a place where the wind carried prayers directly to the ears of the spirits, and the rising sun blessed the departed with light from the world beyond. He had chanted the ancient songs alone, his voice echoing across stone formations, carved by wind and rain into shapes that seemed to mirror the faces of the ancestors. When the ceremony was complete, I knew that my old life was finished. He continued, his fingers resuming their work on the leather with movements that seemed automatic, born of long practice. The man who had been Ayana's husband, who had served as a bridge between the white world and the Apache world, who had believed that peace was possible through patience and understanding. That man died with her on that mountain. The transformation he described was delivered matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing changes in the weather. Beatrice found herself deeply moved by the quiet dignity with which he spoke of his loss. The absence of self-pity or dramatic gestures that would have accompanied such a story, if told by most of the men she had known. There was something profoundly honest about his grief, something that made her own pain feel less shameful and isolated. I was riding home to gather my things and leave the territory forever when I heard your voice in the darkness, he said, finally looking directly at her for the first time since beginning his story. Perhaps the spirits guided me to that place, or perhaps it was simply chance. But finding you there, seeing what had been done to you, it reminded me that there are different kinds of death, and not all of them involve the stopping of breath. His observation carried unexpected insight into her own condition. The revelation that Koa had been planning to leave the territory permanently when he discovered her tied to the cottonwood added new dimensions to Beatrice's understanding of her rescue. He had not simply been a passerby who happened upon her plight. He had been a man at his own crossroads, facing his own moment of decision about whether to continue fighting for a world that had caused him so much pain. You were leaving, she said, the statement carrying undertones of both gratitude and concern. Because of me, you've changed your plans, put yourself at risk. The men who did this to me, they won't hesitate to hurt you if they discover you helped me. Jake Morrison and his friends, they're not just cruel, they're dangerous. They have connections, protection money. Her warning was motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of a man who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had turned away. Koa set down the leather he had been working and moved to the window where morning light illuminated his features with golden clarity. I have been thinking about this through the night, he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. There are 2 paths before us now. I can take you back to your father's house, return you to the safety of your old life, and continue with my plan to leave this place forever, or ... He paused, apparently weighing the wisdom of voicing the alternative. Or, Beatrice prompted, though something in his tone suggested that the second option would be far more complex and dangerous than the first. She found herself hoping that he would not simply deliver her back to Copper Ridge like a lost piece of property, though she could not articulate exactly why the prospect of returning to her previous existence filled her with such dread. Or, We can make them face consequences for what they have done, he said quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Not Apache justice, which would be swift and final, but white man's justice, which requires evidence and witnesses and political maneuvering. It would mean staying, fighting, risking everything on the chance that truth might prove stronger than money and connections. The challenge implicit in his words was clear. The choice he offered was between safety and justice, between the known misery of her old life and the uncertain dangers of seeking accountability from men who considered themselves above the law. It was a decision that would define not only her immediate future, but the kind of person she would choose to become in the wake of her ordeal. If we choose that path, she said carefully, testing the weight of the words as they left her lips, what would it require? How would we even begin to fight men like Jake Morrison, who have the sheriff and half the town council in their pockets? The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable, but something in Koa's manner suggested that he had already begun formulating a plan. Koa's smile was the first she had seen from him, a transformation that softened his features and revealed glimpses of the man he had been before grief had carved lines of sorrow around his eyes. You assume that all white men in positions of authority are corrupt or cowardly, he said with gentle humor. This is understandable given your recent experiences, but not entirely accurate. There are honest lawmen in this territory, judges who cannot be bought, newspaper editors who value truth more than advertising revenue. His confidence suggested knowledge based on experience rather than naive optimism. The plan that emerged from their morning conversation was audacious in its scope and dangerous in its implications. Rather than simply reporting the crime to local authorities who might be sympathetic to Jake Morrison's family connections, they would build an ironclad case that could not be ignored or dismissed, gathering evidence and testimony that would make prosecution inevitable. The sign they hung around your neck, Koa said, producing the crude placard from his saddlebags where he had stored it as evidence. This paper, this handwriting, the rope they used, all of these things can be traced to their sources. More importantly, 6 men cannot keep such a secret indefinitely. One of them will drink too much and boast of their cleverness, or develop a conscience and seek absolution, or simply make a mistake that reveals their involvement. His analysis was methodical and thorough. Beatrice studied the hateful message that had been tied around her neck like a badge of shame, seeing it now not as a symbol of her humiliation, but as proof of her attacker's guilt. The handwriting was distinctive, the paper expensive enough to suggest a limited number of sources, the rope itself bearing distinctive markings that might be traced to specific suppliers. There is something else, Koa added, his tone growing more serious. Something that will make this fight more dangerous for both of us. I am Apache, and you are a white woman. Even if we prove their guilt beyond question, there will be those who say that you deserve what happened to you for associating with a savage, that I must have corrupted you or forced you to lie about your rescue. The racial dynamics of the territory would complicate every aspect of their quest for justice. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, Beatrice said, surprised by the determination in her own voice. We'll have to build a case so strong, gather support so broad, that even the most prejudiced people will have to acknowledge the truth. The woman who spoke these words was not the same frightened girl who had been lured to the chapel ruins by a false letter. As morning melted into afternoon and the mountain sun warmed the hidden valley, 2 unlikely allies began planning a campaign that would challenge not only the specific men who had committed a terrible crime, but the entire system of privilege and prejudice that had made such a crime possible in the first place. 3 days had passed since Beatrice's rescue, and the hidden valley had become a fortress of planning and preparation as Koa and his unlikely partner developed their strategy for exposing Jake Morrison and his Confederates. The morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. Samuel Harrison, a grizzled frontier physician whose weathered face and calloused hands spoke of decades spent treating everything from gunshot wounds to childbirth complications in the harsh territory. Koa had sent word through carefully maintained channels, utilizing the network of Apache scouts and sympathetic traders who moved between the reservation and white settlements like invisible threads, connecting two worlds. Dr. Harrison had been treating tuberculosis patients on the reservation for years. One of the few white professionals who showed genuine respect for Apache people and their traditional healing methods. Jesus Christ Almighty, the doctor muttered as he examined the rope burns on Beatrice's wrists and the deep bruises that still marked her torso where the bonds had cut into soft flesh. His hands were gentle despite their roughness, and his eyes burned with a cold fury that made his professional demeanor all the more impressive. "Begging your pardon for the language, miss, but I've seen plenty of cruelty in my time, and this ranks among the worst. These injuries were inflicted deliberately, systematically, by men who took pleasure in causing pain." His medical assessment would prove crucial in any legal proceedings. Dr. Harrison had brought more than medical supplies to the mountain cabin. Hidden in his black leather bag, beneath bottles of laudanum and rolls of clean bandages, were documents that would form the foundation of their case against Morrison and his accomplices. The letter that had lured Beatrice to the chapel ruins, carefully preserved despite her ordeal, represented the first piece of physical evidence in what would become an elaborate puzzle of guilt and conspiracy. "The paper is expensive," the doctor observed, holding the false invitation up to the cabin window where afternoon light revealed watermarks and manufacturing details, invisible under normal circumstances. "This grade of stationery is only sold by 2 shops in the entire territory, both of them in Santa Fe. More importantly, the ink shows signs of having been mixed with whiskey, which suggests it was written by someone who was drinking while composing. A drunk man makes mistakes he would never make sober." His trained eye caught details that would have escaped notice from less experienced observers. Beatrice watched the examination with growing excitement, seeing for the first time how the methodical accumulation of evidence might actually lead to justice rather than merely revenge. The transformation from victim to investigator was gradual but unmistakable, as if her ordeal had burned away the passive acceptance that had characterized her previous existence, and revealed a core of steel she had never known she possessed. "There's something else," Dr. Harrison continued, producing a small magnifying glass from his medical kit and studying the letter's signature with scientific precision. "This handwriting shows signs of deliberate disguise, but certain characteristics are impossible to completely mask. The way the T is crossed, the formation of capital letters, the pressure applied to downstrokes. These are habits formed in childhood and maintained throughout life. If we can obtain samples of the suspect's natural handwriting, comparison will be possible." The scientific approach to criminal investigation was relatively new to frontier justice. While the mountain sanctuary remained hidden from prying eyes, Copper Ridge itself buzzed with speculation and rumor about the mysterious disappearance of Mayor Fletcher's daughter. The official story, carefully crafted by the mayor's political allies, suggested that Beatrice had been kidnapped by Mexican bandits or rogue Apache warriors. a narrative that played into existing prejudices while deflecting attention from local suspects. Koa had made several scouting trips into town during the 3 days since the rescue, moving through Copper Ridge's back alleys and shadowed doorways like a ghost gathering intelligence. His Apache heritage, which would normally make him conspicuous in a white settlement, actually provided perfect camouflage for espionage, since most townspeople simply refused to see Native Americans as individual human beings capable of complex thought and planning. The information he gathered painted a picture of a community in denial about its own capacity for evil. Jake Morrison and his 5 accomplices had been seen drinking in Hannigan's saloon on the night of Beatrice's disappearance, establishing what they believed to be perfect alibis while simultaneously celebrating their crime with increasingly drunken boasts about teaching uppity women their proper place in society. Morrison's been spreading the story about seeing Apache raiders near the chapel ruins that night, Koa reported during one of his evening returns to the cabin. Claims he and his boys chased them off but arrived too late to prevent the kidnapping. It's a clever lie because it explains his presence in the area while casting himself as a hero rather than a villain. The sheriff is organizing posses to search Apache territory, which keeps everyone looking in the wrong direction. The manipulation of racial fears was both predictable and effective, but not everyone in Copper Ridge accepted the official narrative without question. Father Miguel Santos, the Spanish priest who ministered to the town's Mexican population, had heard confessions that troubled his conscience deeply. While bound by sacred vows never to reveal the specific content of confessional conversations, he had approached Dr. Harrison with carefully worded concerns about certain young men whose recent behavior suggested spiritual corruption of the most serious kind. More significantly, Sarah Chun, the Chinese-American woman who ran the town's laundry and had developed an unofficial network of domestic workers who saw and heard everything that happened in Copper Ridge's most prominent households, had noticed dramatic changes in the behavior and mood of several cowboys who had previously been regular customers. Their sudden nervousness, their reluctance to make eye contact, their whispered conversations that stopped whenever she approached, all suggested guilty knowledge of something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Tommy Briggs, the youngest and least intelligent of Morrison's confederates, made a critical error that would eventually unravel the entire conspiracy. Drunk on rotgut whiskey and desperate to impress a saloon girl with tales of his masculine prowess, he had boasted about participating in what he called the best prank ever played on a stuck-up fat girl who thought she was better than honest. Working men, the saloon girl, whose name was Rosa Martinez and whose intelligence far exceeded what most men assumed about women in her profession, had listened to Briggs' drunken confessions with growing horror and disgust. She had seen Beatrice Fletcher around town, had noticed the cruel treatment the mayor's daughter endured from supposedly respectable citizens, and had felt sympathy for another woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Rosa's decision to approach Dr. Harrison with information about Briggs' confession was motivated partly by conscience and partly by practical considerations. As a Mexican woman working in a saloon, she occupied one of the lowest positions in Copper Ridge's social hierarchy. But she also understood that silence in the face of such cruelty made her complicit in the crime itself. He described details that only someone who was there could know, Rosa told Dr. Harrison during a clandestine meeting in the back room of the doctor's office. The way they tied the ropes, the exact wording of the sign they hung around her neck, even the fact that she cried without making sound because of the gag. He was proud of it. bragging like it was some great accomplishment instead of a shameful crime against an innocent woman. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing the timeline and details of the assault. Dr. Harrison had also been gathering physical evidence through his extensive network of professional contacts throughout the territory. The rope used to bind Beatrice bore distinctive markings that indicated it had been manufactured in Colorado and sold through a specific network of suppliers. More importantly, the expensive paper used for the false letter had indeed come from one of only 2 shops in Santa Fe, and the proprietor kept meticulous records of every customer who purchased such high-quality stationery. Charlie Watts bought a full packet of this exact paper 3 weeks ago, Dr. Harrison reported to Koa and Beatrice during one of their evening strategy sessions. Paid cash, claimed he needed it for important correspondence with business associates in Denver. The shopkeeper remembered him specifically because he insisted on the most expensive grade available and seemed nervous about the purchase. Kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected to be caught doing something wrong. The paper trail was beginning to form a noose around the conspirators' necks. As word of their investigation spread through carefully selected channels, other allies began to emerge from unexpected corners of territorial society. Judge William Henley, Charlie Watts' own uncle and a man whose reputation for integrity had survived 30 years on the frontier bench, approached Dr. Harrison with disturbing information about his nephew's recent behavior and requests for money to cover mysterious debts. Charlie came to me 2 weeks ago asking for a loan to pay off gambling debts, Judge Henley confided during a private meeting at his ranch outside town. Claimed he owed money to some dangerous men in Santa Fe and needed $500 immediately. When I pressed him for details, he became evasive and angry, accused me of not trusting family. Now I'm wondering if those debts were connected to planning this atrocity rather than cards or dice. Family loyalty warred with judicial duty in the judge's troubled conscience. More importantly, Judge Henley possessed the legal authority and political connections necessary to ensure that any case brought against Morrison and his accomplices would receive proper attention from territorial authorities. His reputation for fairness and his relationship with the territorial governor made him a crucial ally in their quest for justice. Captain Maria Vasquez of the Territorial Rangers represented another unexpected source of support for their investigation. The daughter of a prominent Mexican family who had earned her position through exceptional skill and determination rather than political connections, Captain Vasquez had built her career on cases that other law enforcement officials found too complex or politically sensitive to pursue. I've been watching Jake Morrison and his friends for months, Captain Vasquez revealed during a secret meeting arranged through Dr. Harrison's network. They've been involved in at least 3 other incidents of violence against Mexican families, cases where the local sheriff claimed there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. This pattern of targeting vulnerable people who can't fight back effectively is classic predatory behavior, and it usually escalates until someone with real authority steps in to stop it. Her professional assessment confirmed their suspicions about the systematic nature of the conspiracy. The Ranger captain brought more than moral support to their cause. Her authority to investigate crimes throughout the territory meant that she could legally pursue evidence and question witnesses without interference from local officials who might be compromised by political or financial relationships with the suspects. As their investigation gained momentum, the risks to both Koa and Beatrice multiplied exponentially. Jake Morrison had begun to suspect that his carefully constructed narrative was being challenged by forces he could not identify or control, and his response was to increase pressure on anyone who might pose a threat to his version of events. Morrison's father, Robert Morrison, owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory and wielded political influence that extended all the way to the territorial capital. The elder Morrison had built his fortune through a combination of legitimate business practices and carefully orchestrated violence against competitors, and he was not a man who allowed challenges to his family's interests to go unanswered. The Morrison ranch hands have been asking questions around town, Koa reported after one of his reconnaissance missions to Copper Ridge. They're offering money for information about anyone who might be helping investigate what they call false accusations against honest cowboys. They're also spreading rumors that Apache raiders are still in the area, trying to keep people afraid and looking in the wrong direction. The psychological warfare was as dangerous as any physical threat. More ominously, several of the people who had provided information or assistance to their investigation had begun experiencing mysterious difficulties. Rosa Martinez found herself banned from several establishments where she had previously been welcome, her income threatened by a coordinated campaign to destroy her reputation. Father Santos received visits from Morrison ranch hands who made veiled threats about the safety of his parishioners if he continued to interfere in matters that don't concern him. The pressure was designed to isolate Beatrice and Koa from their support network, to make their quest for justice so costly to innocent people that they would abandon their efforts rather than see others suffer for their cause. It was a strategy that had worked effectively in previous cases where the Morrison family had faced legal challenges. But the campaign of intimidation had an unexpected consequence. Rather than frightening potential allies into silence, it convinced many previously neutral parties that Morrison and his associates were indeed guilty of serious crimes and were willing to commit additional offenses to cover their tracks. The heavy-handed tactics actually strengthened the resolve of people who might otherwise have remained uninvolved. As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks around their hidden sanctuary, Koa and Beatrice finalized their strategy for bringing Morrison and his accomplices to justice. The plan they developed was audacious in scope, requiring precise timing and the coordinated efforts of allies scattered throughout the territory. "We have enough evidence to prove what happened," Beatrice said during one of their planning sessions, her voice carrying a confidence that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. "The physical evidence, witness testimony, financial records, all of it points to Morrison and his friends. But evidence means nothing if we can't get it before an honest judge in a court that isn't controlled by Morrison money." The legal and political obstacles remained formidable. Koa had been studying the territorial legal system with the same methodical attention he had once applied to military tactics, identifying weaknesses and opportunities that could be exploited by those with sufficient courage and intelligence. "There is a territorial circuit court session scheduled for December in Santa Fe," he explained, spreading hand-drawn maps across the cabin's wooden table. "Judge Patricia Clearwater presides, and she has a reputation for integrity that even Morrison's father cannot challenge. If we can get our case before her court, we have a chance for real justice." The opportunity represented their best hope for success. The plan required them to emerge from their mountain sanctuary and travel to Santa Fe with enough evidence and witnesses to ensure prosecution of the 6 men who had committed the crime. But the journey would be dangerous, taking them through territory where Morrison's influence was strong, and his willingness to use violence to protect his interests was well established. "We'll need more than evidence," Captain Vasquez had warned during her last visit to the cabin. We'll need protection during the journey and political support once we reach Santa Fe. Morrison has friends in the territorial capital, men who owe him favors and will work to undermine any case against his son. This fight is about more than seeking justice for one crime. It's about challenging a system of corruption that has protected men like Morrison for decades. The stakes could not have been higher as they prepared for the next phase of their dangerous mission. Both Koa and Beatrice understood that they had passed the point of no return. The evidence they had gathered made them targets for violence, but it also made them symbols of hope for everyone who had ever been victimized by men who believed their wealth and connections placed them above the law. The battle for justice was about to move from the hidden mountain valley to the public stage, where the entire territory would witness the outcome. The first attempt on their lives came at dawn on a Tuesday morning when the mountain air was crystal clear, and the silence of the hidden valley was shattered by the crack of rifle fire echoing off granite walls. Koa had been tending to Storm Walker near the stream that fed the valley when a bullet splintered the pine bark 6 inches from his head, followed immediately by the thunder of hoofbeats as 8 armed riders charged down the narrow trail that led to their sanctuary. Jake Morrison led the assault personally, his face twisted with rage and desperation as he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling faster than he could repair it. Behind him rode his original 5 accomplices plus 2 hired gunmen from his father's ranch, men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold coins and promises of protection from territorial authorities, who might ask uncomfortable questions about their methods. Kill the Apache. Morrison screamed as his horse plunged down the rocky slope, his rifle smoking from the shot that had nearly ended Koa's life. Take the girl alive, but make sure that Red Devil never testifies against anyone. The orders revealed both the depth of his desperation and the calculating cruelty that had motivated the original crime. Koa rolled behind a boulder as more shots rang out, his own rifle appearing in his hands with the fluid grace of a man who had learned combat skills in Apache war parties and refined them during his years as a territorial scout. The hidden valley had been chosen partly for its defensive advantages, with steep walls and limited approaches that would funnel attackers into killing zones where superior numbers meant little. Beatrice crouched inside the cabin, her heart pounding with terror but her mind surprisingly clear as she watched the battle unfold through the small window. Koa had cut facing the main approach. The woman who had once cowered helplessly while cruel men tormented her for sport was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required fighting back with whatever weapons were available. The tactical situation favored the defenders despite being outnumbered nearly 4-1. Morrison's men were attacking uphill against prepared positions, their horses struggling on terrain better suited to mountain goats than cavalry charges. More importantly, their leader's rage had overcome his strategic sense, turning what should have been a careful ambush into a frontal assault that played to Koa's strengths as a guerrilla fighter. Koa's first shot dropped Charlie Watts from his saddle with a bullet through the shoulder that sent him tumbling into a rocky ravine where his screams echoed like the cries of a wounded animal. The Apache warrior's marksmanship had been honed during years of hunting both game and men through some of the most challenging terrain in North America, making him deadlier than an entire squad of conventional soldiers in this environment. Tommy Briggs, the young cowboy whose drunken confessions had provided crucial evidence for their investigation, panicked when he saw Watts fall and wheeled his horse around in a desperate attempt to flee back up the trail. But Koa had anticipated such a move, and his second shot shattered the animal's front leg, sending both horse and rider crashing into a stand of aspen trees with bone-breaking force. "Stand and fight, you cowards!" Morrison roared at his remaining men, but the tide of battle had already turned against them. The hired gunman had expected to face a helpless woman and an isolated Apache man, not a prepared defensive position held by someone who fought with the tactical brilliance of a professional soldier. From inside the cabin, Beatrice contributed to the defense in ways that Morrison's men never anticipated. She had spent the previous weeks learning to load rifles and prepare ammunition under Koa's patient instruction, understanding that their mission might eventually require her to fight for her own life. Now those lessons proved invaluable as she passed loaded weapons through the window, allowing Koa to maintain continuous fire without pausing to reload. The battle raged for nearly an hour, echoing through the mountain canyons like thunder from a particularly violent storm. Buck Henley took a bullet through the thigh that left him unable to maintain his seat, while one of the hired gunmen simply abandoned his position and fled when he realized that easy money had turned into a fight for survival against an opponent who clearly outclassed him in every aspect of combat. Jake Morrison himself proved more persistent than his companions, using his knowledge of the local terrain to work his way around to a flanking position where he could fire down into the valley from an elevated rocky outcrop. His shots came dangerously close to finding their targets, forcing Koa to divide his attention between multiple threats while maintaining the defensive perimeter that protected both himself and Beatrice. The sound of additional hoofbeats approaching the valley might have signaled disaster for the defenders, but the riders who appeared at the head of the trail wore the distinctive uniforms of the territorial rangers rather than the rough clothing of Morrison's ranch hands. Captain Maria Vasquez led a squad of 6 rangers who had been tracking Morrison's movements for days, waiting for him to make exactly the kind of mistake that would justify their intervention. "Jake Morrison," Captain Vasquez's voice carried across the valley with the authority of territorial law behind it. "You are surrounded by territorial rangers and under arrest for assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder. Surrender immediately or face the consequences of continued resistance." Her ultimatum was delivered with professional calm despite the ongoing gunfire. Morrison's response was to turn his rifle toward the Rangers and fire wildly in their direction, a decision that sealed his fate and eliminated any possibility of claiming that his assault on the valley had been motivated by anything other than criminal intent. The Rangers responded with disciplined volleys that quickly ended the threat he posed, though they were careful to wound rather than kill since his testimony would be needed for the trials that would follow. The surrender of Morrison's remaining men came swiftly once their leader was down and they found themselves facing professional lawmen rather than isolated civilians. Buck Henley and the surviving hired gunmen threw down their weapons and raised their hands, understanding that continued resistance would likely result in their deaths rather than their escape. Tommy Briggs required medical attention for injuries sustained in his fall, but he was conscious enough to begin confessing his role in the original crime, even before Captain Vasquez had finished securing the scene. The young cowboy's nerve had finally broken completely, and he seemed eager to unburden himself of guilt that had been eating away at his conscience for weeks. It was Morrison's idea. Briggs babbled as Dr. Harrison examined his injuries. "We just went along because we were drunk and stupid. But it was Jake who planned everything. Jake who wrote that fake letter. Jake who decided to leave her tied to that tree like an animal. I tried to tell him it had gone too far, but he said anyone who backed out would regret it for the rest of their short lives." His confession provided the final pieces of evidence needed to ensure convictions. As the dust settled from the battle and the wounded were tended by Dr. Harrison's medical expertise, the full scope of the network that had formed around Koa and Beatrice's quest for justice became apparent. Captain Vasquez revealed that she had been coordinating with allies throughout the territory for weeks, building a case that extended far beyond the single crime committed against Beatrice Fletcher. Morrison and his associates have been terrorizing vulnerable people throughout this region for years, the ranger captain explained as her men secured the prisoners and collected evidence from the battlefield. Mexican families driven from their land by mysterious fires and vandalism. Apache individuals who disappeared after leaving the reservation on legitimate business. Women from all backgrounds who suffered harassment and worse. Your case gave us the evidence we needed to connect all these crimes to the same group of perpetrators. The pattern of systematic violence was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Judge William Henley had arrived with the Rangers, his presence ensuring that legal proceedings could begin immediately rather than being delayed by bureaucratic obstacles or political interference. The elderly jurist's face was grim as he surveyed the scene of battle and listened to his nephew's confession, understanding that his own family's reputation would be forever tainted by association with these crimes. Charlie brought shame on our family name, Judge Henley said quietly as he watched his nephew being loaded into a wagon for transport to Santa Fe. But justice must be served regardless of blood relationships. The law applies equally to all men, or it applies to none. His commitment to legal principles over family loyalty would prove crucial in the trials that followed. Father Miguel Santos had also made the dangerous journey to the Hidden Valley, bringing with him written statements from parishioners who had witnessed various aspects of the conspiracy but had been too frightened to speak out until protected by territorial authority. The priest's moral courage in gathering these testimonies, despite threats against his own safety, demonstrated the power of conscience to overcome fear. Rosa Martinez, the saloon girl whose information had helped break the case open, stood beside Captain Vasquez with tears streaming down her face as she watched the men who had terrorized her community being taken into custody. "I never thought this day would come," she whispered to Beatrice. "I never thought anyone would care enough about people like us to risk everything for justice." Her words captured the significance of what had been accomplished. Word of Jake Morrison's arrest and the discovery of the systematic campaign of violence he had orchestrated spread through Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory like wildfire, igniting political upheavals that would reshape the region's power structure. Mayor Theodore Fletcher, who had spent weeks organizing search parties based on false information about his daughter's disappearance, found himself facing demands for his resignation from citizens who felt betrayed by his inability to protect his own family. Robert Morrison, the cattle baron whose wealth and influence had protected his son's criminal activities for years, discovered that money could not purchase immunity from the territorial governor's determination to restore law and order to a region that had become a haven for vigilante violence. Federal marshals arrived to investigate his ranch operations, finding evidence of tax evasion and land fraud that would eventually result in his own imprisonment. Sheriff William Crawford, whose cozy relationship with the Morrison family had blinded him to obvious evidence of criminal activity, was suspended from office pending a territorial investigation into his conduct. The revelation that he had accepted substantial payments from Morrison interests in exchange for looking the other way during previous incidents of violence ended his law enforcement career and opened him to criminal charges. The ripple effects extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in the conspiracy. Business partnerships dissolved as merchants and ranchers distanced themselves from anyone associated with the Morrison name, while political alliances that had seemed stable for decades crumbled under the weight of public outrage over the systematic abuse of power. Captain Vasquez used the momentum generated by these arrests to launch investigations into similar patterns of violence throughout the territory, armed with new authority from Santa Fe to pursue cases that local officials had previously ignored or suppressed. Her success in the Fletcher case established her as the territorial government's primary weapon against organized criminal activity. The territorial legislature, responding to public pressure and newspaper coverage of the case, passed new laws, strengthening protections for witnesses and victims of violent crimes, while increasing penalties for those who used wealth and political connections to escape justice. The Fletcher case became a symbol of the territory's commitment to equal treatment under law, regardless of social position. As the immediate crisis passed and the machinery of justice began processing the arrested conspirators, Koa and Beatrice found themselves dealing with the complex emotions that followed their victory over seemingly impossible odds. The satisfaction of seeing their tormentors brought to account was tempered by recognition of the prices that had been paid and the challenges that still lay ahead. The hidden valley that had served as their sanctuary throughout the investigation had been compromised by the attack, its location now known to territorial authorities and potentially to other enemies who might seek revenge for Morrison's downfall. Koa would have to abandon the retreat that had provided him with peace during the worst period of his grief, adding another loss to his already substantial catalog of sacrifices. Beatrice faced the daunting prospect of returning to a society that had witnessed her public humiliation and would now observe her transformation from victim to victor with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. The woman who had been mocked for her size and social awkwardness had become a symbol of resistance against injustice, but symbols often found it difficult to live normal lives. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the simple dynamic of rescuer and rescued, developing into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to principles larger than their individual interests. But the racial and cultural barriers that divided their worlds had not disappeared simply because they had fought together for a common cause. What happens now? Beatrice asked as they stood together in the valley where they had planned their campaign for justice and fought their battle for survival. The question carried implications that extended far beyond immediate practical concerns to encompass fundamental choices about how they would structure their lives going forward. Koa's answer reflected the wisdom he had gained through years of navigating between two worlds that often seemed determined to destroy each other. Now we discover whether the justice we fought for can survive the peace that follows. Whether the alliances we built will endure when the immediate threat is gone. Whether two people from different worlds can find a way to share the same future. His words acknowledged both the uncertainty they faced and the hope that had sustained them through their darkest hours, as the sun set over the mountain valley that had sheltered their conspiracy against injustice. Koa and Beatrice Fletcher stood as living proof that ordinary people could triumph over systematic oppression when they found the courage to stand together against those who wielded power without conscience. Their victory had cost them much and would demand even more in the years to come. But it had also demonstrated the transformative power of moral courage, applied with intelligence and determination. The battle was won, but the war for justice in a territory torn between progress and tradition would continue long after the last echo of gunfire had faded from the mountain canyons where two unlikely allies had chosen to fight rather than submit to the cruelty of men who mistook wealth for virtue and violence for strength. 6 months after the battle in the Hidden Valley, the territorial courthouse in Santa Fe became the stage for trials that would reshape the legal landscape of New Mexico Territory. Judge Patricia Clearwater presided over proceedings that drew spectators from across the Southwest, as newspaper correspondents and curious citizens packed the galleries to witness what many called the most significant criminal case in territorial history. Jake Morrison sat in the defendant's dock with his once proud bearing reduced to the hunched posture of a man who had discovered that money and family connections could not purchase immunity from territorial justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming: physical proof, witness testimony, and his own men's confessions had created an unbreakable chain of guilt that even the most expensive lawyers could not challenge. Beatrice Fletcher took the witness stand on a crisp December morning, her transformation from terrified victim to confident advocate visible to everyone in the courtroom. She wore a simple blue dress that had been tailored to fit her properly, and her voice carried clear and strong as she recounted the details of her ordeal without shame or hesitation. The woman who testified bore little resemblance to the broken girl who had been tied to a cottonwood tree as entertainment for cruel men. They wanted to destroy me because I represented something they could not control, she told the packed courtroom, her eyes fixed on Morrison as she spoke. A woman who refused to accept their judgment of her worth, who dared to exist in their world without seeking their approval. My crime was not conforming to their expectations of what a woman should be, and their punishment was designed to teach other women what happened to those who forgot their place. Her testimony transcended the specific details of her case to address broader questions of power and prejudice. Koa's appearance as a witness created a stir in the courtroom, as many territorial residents had never seen an Apache man testify in a legal proceeding as an equal participant rather than a defendant or curiosity. His dignified bearing and articulate testimony challenged every stereotype about his people, forcing observers to confront their own assumptions about race and civilization. I found Miss Fletcher bound to a tree like an animal prepared for slaughter, he testified, his formal English contrasting sharply with the crude language that had characterized much of the defense's arguments. The men who did this believed that her perceived weakness and my racial status would protect them from consequences. They were wrong. His words carried the weight of someone who had bridged two worlds and found strength in both. The guilty verdicts came swiftly, delivered by a jury that included Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and women alongside the traditional white male jurors. Jake Morrison received 15 years in territorial prison for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy, while his accomplices faced sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement in the crime. Judge Clearwater's sentencing speech became legendary in territorial legal circles for its eloquent condemnation of the attitudes that had motivated the crime. This court finds that the defendants acted not from passion or temporary madness, but from a calculated belief that certain classes of people exist for their entertainment and abuse, she declared. Such attitudes have no place in a civilized society, and this court will ensure that those who hold them face appropriate consequences. Her words established precedents that would influence territorial law for decades. The conviction sent shockwaves through the network of wealthy families who had used violence and intimidation to maintain their dominance over territorial politics and economics. Robert Morrison's empire crumbled as federal investigations revealed decades of criminal activity hidden behind a facade of respectability, while other powerful men scrambled to distance themselves from associates whose protection had suddenly evaporated. Captain Maria Vasquez was promoted to regional commander of the Territorial Rangers, with expanded authority to investigate corruption and organized violence throughout the Southwest. Her success in the Fletcher case had demonstrated the effectiveness of professional law enforcement, guided by principles of justice rather than political expediency. Dr. Samuel Harrison established a clinic in Santa Fe specifically designed to treat victims of violence and provide medical testimony in criminal cases, understanding that his expertise could serve justice as effectively as it served healing. His documentation of Beatrice's injuries had proved crucial in securing convictions, establishing medical evidence as a powerful tool in the fight against organized cruelty. As winter melted into spring and the legal proceedings concluded, Koa and Beatrice faced decisions about their future that would determine not only their personal happiness, but the broader question of whether their alliance could survive in a society still divided by racial and cultural barriers. The hidden valley where they had planned their campaign for justice had been sold to the territorial government as a nature preserve, ensuring that it would remain unspoiled, but making it impossible for them to return. Beatrice's relationship with her father had evolved into something approaching mutual respect, though Theodore Fletcher struggled to understand how his sheltered daughter had transformed into a woman capable of challenging powerful men and winning. Their conversations revealed the generational divide between those who accepted social hierarchy as natural law and those who questioned its fundamental assumptions. "You've become someone I don't recognize," Mayor Fletcher told his daughter during one of their difficult reconciliation meetings. "The girl I raised would never have associated with. People like that Apache man would never have put herself in such danger for abstract principles like justice." His inability to understand her choices reflected broader societal confusion about women who refused to accept traditional limitations. Beatrice's response revealed the depth of her transformation and the clarity of her new understanding about what truly mattered in life. "The girl you raised was afraid of her own shadow and believed that other people's opinions determined her worth," she replied without anger or accusation. "The woman I've become understands that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite fear." Koa taught me that, along with many other lessons about honor and dignity that I never learned in all my years of proper society education. Her words established boundaries that her father would have to accept if he wanted any relationship with his daughter. The solution to their dilemma came from an unexpected source when the territorial governor offered Koa a position as special investigator for Native American affairs, with authority to examine conflicts between tribal communities and white settlers throughout the Southwest. The job would require extensive travel and complex negotiations, but it would also provide him with the resources and legal standing necessary to protect vulnerable people from the kind of systematic abuse they had uncovered in Copper Ridge. Beatrice's role in this new partnership evolved naturally from her experience in gathering evidence and building coalitions during their investigation of Morrison's crimes. Her social connections among territorial women's organizations and her newfound reputation as an advocate for justice made her an invaluable ally in cases where traditional law enforcement methods proved inadequate. Their first joint case involved a series of mysterious disappearances among young Apache women who had left the reservation to work in white households, incidents that local authorities had dismissed as runaways seeking adventure in town life. Koa's cultural knowledge and Beatrice's Investigative skills uncovered a trafficking network that extended across territorial boundaries, leading to arrests that freed dozens of victims and dismantled an organization that had operated with impunity. For years, the success of their partnership challenged conventional assumptions about both professional relationships and personal boundaries in territorial society. Here was an Apache man and a white woman working together as equals, their collaboration based on mutual respect and shared commitment to principles that transcended racial and cultural divisions. The romantic relationship that developed between Koa and Beatrice was as inevitable as it was controversial, growing from shared danger and mutual admiration into something deeper and more lasting than either had expected to find in their complicated lives. Their love story unfolded against the backdrop of a society still struggling to accept basic concepts of racial equality, making every public appearance a political statement whether they intended it or not. The wedding ceremony took place in the same Santa Fe courthouse where they had testified against Morrison and his accomplices, officiated by Judge Clearwater in a deliberately public declaration that love could triumph over prejudice when supported by courage and determination. The guest list included representatives from across the territorial spectrum, Apache leaders, Mexican families, white professionals, and government officials who had learned to respect the couple's contributions to justice and social progress. Father Miguel Santos provided the religious blessing that made their union sacred as well as legal. His homily focusing on the biblical principle that love recognizes no boundaries of race or culture when it is guided by divine grace. These two people have shown us that the greatest love is that which requires sacrifice and courage, he declared. They have chosen each other not despite their differences, but because their differences make them stronger together than either could be alone. His words captured the essential truth of their relationship. The honeymoon they took in the mountains where they had first found safety together was interrupted by urgent requests for their assistance in cases throughout the territory, as word of their effectiveness in fighting organized crime and corruption spread among communities that had previously had no recourse against powerful oppressors. Their personal happiness had become inseparable from their mission to create a more just society. 5 years after Beatrice Fletcher was found tied to a cottonwood tree by an Apache warrior riding home from his wife's burial, the territory of New Mexico had become a model for other regions struggling with questions of racial justice and women's rights. The precedents established by their case had been applied in dozens of subsequent prosecutions, creating a legal framework that protected vulnerable people from those who would exploit their perceived powerlessness. The investigative agency they established became the template for professional law enforcement organizations throughout the American West, combining traditional detective work with cultural sensitivity and community partnership. Their success rate in solving cases that had baffled local authorities earned them national recognition and federal funding that allowed them to expand their operations across multiple territories. Beatrice's transformation from victim to advocate inspired countless other women to challenge the limitations that society had placed on their lives and aspirations. She became a sought-after speaker at women's rights conventions and educational institutions, her story serving as proof that personal courage could overcome even the most entrenched forms of discrimination and abuse. Koa's position as the territory's first Native American federal investigator opened doors for other indigenous people seeking careers in law enforcement and government service. His success in navigating between cultures while maintaining his identity and principles demonstrated that assimilation did not require the abandonment of heritage and tradition. Their love story became legend throughout the Southwest, told and retold in countless variations that emphasize different aspects of their journey from strangers, brought together by crisis to partners united in purpose and affection. The tale of the Apache warrior and the mayor's daughter who refused to accept injustice served as inspiration for generations of young people who faced their own, seemingly impossible challenges as they stood together on the porch of their Santa Fe home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Koa and Beatrice Fletcher Blackhorse reflected on the unexpected path that had brought them from the darkest night of their lives to a future filled with purpose and possibility. Their story had begun with cruelty and despair, but it had become something far greater, a testament to the power of human courage to transform not only individual lives but entire societies when guided by love and justice.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.